Welcome to the Gary DeMar blogcast. This audio is brought to you by Canon Press.
Welcome to another edition of the Gary DeMar blogcast. Today's entry is titled Answering the Last Day Scoffers, the second in a series of three that began with the magical Bible verse that's used to cancel the meaning of more than 100 other Bible verses. In order to understand what 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 8 means, we need to understand the immediate context of 2 Peter 3. The entire argument over when the events Peter describes take place comes down to defining the last days, the identity of the scoffers, the expectation of Peter's audience, the consistent definition of time terms, and how the Bible uses heaven and earth language. First, Peter, similar to James in James chapter 1 verse 1, was writing to Jews scattered throughout the Roman Empire, those who reside as aliens scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. As Jews, they were familiar with Israel's history, promises, and biblical literature. Peter describes their time as these last times in 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 20. He connects the old covenant passing away with the new fulfilled in the person and work of Jesus Christ. He mentions the fiery trial among you, which comes upon you for your testing. For it is time for judgment to begin with the household of God, and if it begins with us first, Peter writes, what will be the outcome of those who do not obey the gospel of God? 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 17. A judgment event was on the horizon that would affect believers and unbelievers when the chief shepherd appears. 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 4. This is not some distant future end-time event. Second, Peter and other New Testament writers wrote as though their readers would be alive when Jesus returned. 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 19, James chapter 5 verses 7 through 9. Peter wrote the following to his Jewish audience. Therefore, beloved, since you look for these things, be diligent to be found by him in peace, spotless and blameless. 2 Peter 3:14. Are we to believe that they looked forward to being incinerated? I don't think so. Third, Peter was answering the objections of scoffers who were questioning the prophecy made by Jesus in the three Gospels that the temple would be destroyed before their generation passed away, Matthew chapter 24:34. In the mid-60s, when Peter wrote his second letter, the temple was still standing, more glorious than ever. These antichrists, yes, these antichrists, not single antichrists, were alive and well in John's day. In fact, if you look at 1 John chapter 2, verses 18 through 22, you'll see that it's clear as a bell that these antichrists were alive and that it was evidence that the last hour of judgment that was going to come upon Jerusalem was going to take place. They were mocking Jesus' prophecy. Where is the promise of his coming, they asked. Jesus said he would come in judgment as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, Matthew 24:27. In addition to the temple being dismantled stone by stone in Matthew 24:2, there would be a lot of dead people who had refused to heed his generation-long warning, verse 28. Let's compare 2 Peter 3, verses 3 through 4 with Jude, verse 18, which reads, in the last time there shall be mockers following after their own ungodly lusts. In the next verse we are told, these are the ones who cause divisions, worldly, minded, devoid of the Spirit, Jude 19. Not will be, but are. Peter and Jude are not predicting what will happen in the distant future. These things were happening in their day. Just like false prophets also arose among the people, there will be also false prophets among you, Peter told his first readers in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 1. Also see 1 John chapter 4, verse 1. The way of the truth will be maligned, and they will exploit you with false words, 2 Peter 2:3. Notice the use of the second person plural. Peter is issuing a warning to those who received his letter. The entire New Testament issues warnings against those skeptics and moral troublemakers, Jude verses 10 through 16, Acts chapter 20 verses 28 through 30. We should not find it unusual, therefore, that Peter would mention scoffers who would mock the faithful that the generation that Jesus said would not pass away before his coming to destroy Jerusalem was about to come to an end and everything remains as it was. These were Jewish scoffers. Peter refers to the fathers that have fallen asleep, 2 Peter 3:4. The use of fathers would have made no sense to a Gentile audience. You can hear these first-century Jewish scoffers arguing this way. The temple is still standing, the priesthood is intact, and animal sacrifices are going on as usual. The old covenant has not passed away. It's a permanent fixture, even under Roman oppression. People are married and giving in marriage, eating and drinking, buying and selling, and planting and building. Everything is as it was since creation. This Jesus, who claimed he would come in judgment before this generation passed away, was a false prophet, and you Christians are foolish to follow him. Return to the true faith of your fathers. In fact, this is one of the reasons why the book of Hebrews was written. It was to remind these Jews not to go back to the old covenant, to old wineskins. They would suffer the similar judgment that those under the old covenant would suffer. If God spoke on earth in one way, he's now speaking from heaven in another way. It's going to be an even more severe judgment if they do not abide by what God had to say. Similar warnings were given when the land was destroyed by a flood and Sodom was destroyed by fire. The people reacted the same way as the scoffers in Peter's day. Things look like they've always looked. The scoffers were alive and well in the first century. People have a right to mock and scoff when they read that Jesus was to come within a generation, and nearly 2,000 years have passed. Liberals mock Christians who don't believe that Jesus said what Jesus said, and then try to make Jesus' words mean something else. Preterists don't doubt God's word. We are not end-time scoffers because we take God at his word when he told us when certain prophetic events would be fulfilled. We believe Jesus when he said he would return in judgment before the generation to whom he was speaking passed away. Matthew chapter 24, verse 34. If you want more specifics on this, see my books, Wars and Rumors of Wars, Is Jesus Coming Soon, and Last Days Madness. You can order them at AmericanVision.org. Preterists marvel when we are accused of allegorizing and not interpreting the Bible literally, and then charged with such rigid literalism on the meaning of this generation. You see, they'll claim they're interpreting the Bible literally, but when we get to the time texts and to a phrase like this generation, they say, oh, you can't take those literally. Look, we believe the Bible when it says that Jesus would come before the last disciple died. John chapter 21, verses 18 through 23, Matthew 16, verses 27 through 28. We believe John when he wrote that many antichrists had arisen in his day, which served as ample evidence to his readers that it was the last hour, 1 John 2:18. We agree with the writer of the Hebrews that the day was drawing near for first century Christians, Hebrews 10:25. We affirm with James when he told his readers that the coming of the Lord is at hand for them, James 5:8, and that the judge is standing right at the door, James 5:9. He must be a tired judge if he's still standing after nearly 2,000 years. The language of 2 Peter 3 is certainly apocalyptic and world-ending, but is Peter describing the end of the space-time universe as we generally conceive it, or is he describing the end of a specific type of world? Peter writes that the world, that is the cosmos at that time, was destroyed. 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 6, that is talking about the flood. But the physical world was not destroyed. When Noah and his family left the ark, the physical world was still there. Peter is using world in a cultural, world and life view sense in terms of what people believed and how they acted on those beliefs. In the case of Noah's time, his world had fallen into the depth of sin and corruption, and it needed to be destroyed. The people had made friendship with the world a priority, James 4:4. The use of world is not the physical world. Consider this passage. If you were of the world would love its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, because of this the world hates you. John chapter 15, verse 19. What world is this? Is it the earth, or what some have described as this world system? In 1 Corinthians 7:31, we learn that the form of this world is passing away. Paul's not talking about the physical world, but a type of world they had created for themselves. Andres Kostenberger, director of PhD studies and senior professor of New Testament and biblical language at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, explains that the Greek word cosmos, world, in John's Gospel typically refers to sinful humanity and only rarely to material creation. It embraces all of humanity, both Jew and Gentile, which sets itself in opposition to God. D.A. Carson, in his commentary on John's Gospel, writes, "The world, or frequently this world, is not the universe, but the created order, especially of human beings and human affairs, in rebellion against its maker." Peter uses world, that is cosmos, in the same way. God did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, 2 Peter 2:5. We find a reference to Noah in the Gospels in the prophetic message Jesus delivered on the Mount of Olives. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah, Matthew 24:37-39. Those taken away were the scoffers who did not heed Noah's warning. The same thing happened in the lead up to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. If Peter's use of cosmos means the earth as a physical body, then the statement is untrue. The earth remained. There were the mountains of Ararat before the flood and after the flood, Genesis 8:4. The world remained. It was the world of the ungodly that was destroyed. Peter uses the word world in a similar way in 2 Peter 3, verses 5-6. For when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the land was formed out of water and by water, through which the world, that is the cosmos at that time, was destroyed, being flooded with water. The world at that time, the world of Noah's time, was destroyed. But it wasn't destroyed in the same way that the original heavens and earth were created. The physical earth remained. It did not cease to exist. The world of the Old Covenant was destroyed when judgment was brought upon it by Jesus. It's interesting that Josephus, the Jewish historian, who has given us a picture of ancient Israel as well as the events surrounding the destruction of the temple in AD 70, compares the construction of the tabernacle as the imitation and representation of the universe that included the threefold division of land, sea, and heavens. See Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews. The Puritan writer John Owen, 17th century, wrote the following in his Providential Changes, an argument for universal holiness, that the heavens and earth were here intended in this prophecy of Peter, the coming of the Lord, the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men, relate not to the last and final judgment of the world, but to that utter desolation and destruction that was to be made of the judicial church and state of Israel. Owen appeals to Luke chapter 21, verses 34 and 36 to support his claim that what Peter states in 2 Peter 3 is what Jesus was referencing in the Olivet Discourse, that is in Matthew chapter 24 as well, the dissolution of the Judaical church and state. Quoting Owen, "As it was foretold and threatened by Christ, how were believers cautioned to be ready for it with eminent holiness and watchfulness therein?" So Luke chapter 21, verses 34-36. "Take heed to yourselves, watch thereof." Why so? Christ is coming, verse 27. When? Why, in this generation, verse 32. What to do? Why, to dissolve heaven and earth, verse 25. To dissolve the Jewish church and state. Watch therefore, give all diligence. So also Matthew chapter 24, verse 42. Again, for a study of the meaning of the passing away of heaven and earth in more detail, see what does Peter mean by the passing away of heaven and earth in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. Again, you can find this at AmericanVision.org.
Thank you for listening to the Gary DeMar blogcast. For more from Gary and American Vision, check out the American Vision collection in the Canon app.